Hello, my name is Caitlin, and I'm here today representing the Mental Health Association of East Tennessee. MHAET works across Tennessee to bring awareness about mental health issues to decrease the stigma associated with these struggles so that more people can get help sooner. Today, I'm going to be sharing about how mental health needs can present themselves in your neighbors and neighborhood, and how you can intervene as an individual and things that can be done at the neighborhood level to improve mental health of all. Since this presentation is pre-recorded and you may not have the opportunity for questions, please feel free to email me at info@mhaet.com with any questions you have. My hope is that after this presentation, you will walk away knowing more about mental health, how you can be a better neighbor, and how we can all foster environments in our neighborhoods that are supportive, which not only decreases someone's risk of experiencing mental distress or mental illness, but can also assist them in their recovery. Finally, I'll be speaking on how to respond in times of crisis to protect not only your safety, but the safety of the person in crisis. First and foremost, something that is essential to speak on when we're talking about mental health is what mental health actually is. For most, there's a fundamental misunderstanding and even some tunnel vision about what mental health is. Most equate the term mental health with being mentally ill, and they then assume that when someone has a mental illness, or I prefer calling them mental health conditions, that they're unstable and dangerous. So in our minds, we think of mental health as a bad thing or something to be afraid of. But that's not what mental health is. Mental health is something we all have. One of my favorite definitions of mental health comes straight from the World Health Organization, and it defines mental health as a state of well-being in which every individual realizes their own potential, is able to cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. This puts the term mental health in terms of something we should always be working toward, something we should always be attempting to achieve. Good mental health enables us to be the best versions of ourselves and the healthiest versions of ourselves. Our mental health is an important component of our overall health and greatly, greatly impacts the well-being of the rest of our body. When we look at how to measure our mental health, picture a thermometer. Let's say at the very top of the thermometer is our optimal mental health. We've reached our full potential, know how to properly cope and manage our emotions. And at the bottom of the thermometer, we're in a mental health crisis where our mental health is at its lowest. So in between the top and bottom, we have all other varying degrees of mental health. And most of us will likely fall somewhere between the two, rising and falling along the continuum depending on what's happening in our life, the traits we have in ourselves that promote resilience or the ability to bounce back, and the resources and supports available are in our community. It's important to know that there is no right or wrong place to be. It's all a part of the journey, and we have to respect where we are and give our feelings the respect and validation they deserve. You should never feel ashamed for struggling with your mental health, nor should someone else experience that shame, even when they're in a crisis. Having optimal mental health doesn't always mean our life is perfect. What it means is that when bad things happen, we handle them in a way that's as healthy as possible. So having optimal mental health also means having healthy social connections, which are generally defined as relationships where there's trust and you have honest and open communication with the other person. Especially during this time of physical distancing, it's important to remember that healthy social relationships don't have to be dependent on being physically near one another. We can maintain healthy relationships over the phone, video calls, writing letters to one another, or meeting in person, but being safely socially distanced. Having a good social support network also decreases someone's risk of depression, alcohol use, health conditions such as cardiovascular disease, and suicide. And being optimally healthy doesn't mean you have to be happy all the time. Sadness and anger are both healthy and natural emotions, and they're an essential part of the human experience to have this broad range of emotions. And these negative emotions, they still deserve our attention. How we express them and manage them indicates how healthy our mental health is. For example, it's not a healthy expression of anger to break objects around us or scream at people we care about. It's also not healthy for us to hide those feelings and shove them down. Instead, there are healthier ways to channel that anger that don't hurt those around us. Things like exercise or even cleaning can be healthy ways to express those emotions. Lastly, our mental health is also impacted by our physical health. We cannot achieve optimal mental health if we're not also taking care of the physical systems in our body that are supporting our mind. Again, there's no expectation for everything to be perfect and amazing. It's more like working with what you have to the best of your ability. So eat as healthy as you can, get some physical activity, and try to prioritize sleep. And again, perfection's not the point. Not everyone has access to the same resources. So just try to do what you can with what you have. And like I said previously, most of us are somewhere in the middle of the scale of mental wellness. We feel pretty okay most of the time, but maybe there are things we do that we know aren't healthy. Things like having a cigarette or a glass of wine after a stressful day. But overall, most days we feel like we're able to cope with day-to-day life. Tolerable mental distress is when we tolerate the change, uncertainties, or negative emotions that we experience, but we don't always cope with them in healthy ways. These day-to-day occurrences do not lead to any major interruptions in our life, and for the most part, we're able to overcome and get past them. Most individuals with untreated or poorly treated mental health conditions also fall sort of in the category of tolerable or moderate distress. However, generally, the longer someone remains untreated, their symptoms increase in their severity, and they're more likely to cause disruptions in day-to-day life. So examples of these disruptions can include the inability to focus, changes in sleep patterns, and increasing levels of sadness or anxiety. And when these things happen, they cause problems across every domain of life, individual, social, and professional. And then crisis is on the lowest end of the mental health scale. And even for those that are struggling with a serious mental health conditions or other things in life, such as the death of a spouse or other major life occurrence, rarely do people stay in crisis long. Crisis tends to be very short lasting. A mental health crisis is a situation where a person's behavior puts them at risk of hurting others or themselves, or prevents them from being able to care for themselves or function effectively in the community. So common examples of mental health crisis include threats or actual harm to self or others. So suicide would fall in this category. Psychosis, which is when someone loses touch with reality, or delusions such as paranoia. Although mental health conditions can contribute to someone's risk of experiencing a crisis, they're not the only reasons that someone experiences a crisis. Crises can also be triggered by life changes, exposure to trauma, natural disasters, or even changes in medication. Experiencing mental distress is not the same thing as having a mental health condition. Although all of us will experience some level of distress that decreases our overall mental wellness, statistically, only about half of the population will meet the diagnostic criteria for a mental illness. Mental health conditions are longer lasting than the general sadness or distress caused by life events, and can potentially lead to impairment in a multitude of life domains. If someone has changes in thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that last almost every day for 2 weeks or more, this can indicate a potential mental illness. So signs that can indicate a mental health condition include changes in sleeping or eating. Sometimes that's more or less. Changes in physical appearance, specifically changes in grooming practices that indicate someone's either obsessed with cleanliness or is becoming increasingly disheveled. I mean, for example, if you think for someone who is hearing voices that are telling them to do things, they may not necessarily be super focused on whether or not they take a shower that day. Other signs of distress include changes in activities the person engages in, specifically if someone stops engaging in something they enjoyed or they seem to no longer find enjoyment from the activity, even if they're still doing it. Changes in levels of social engagement, specifically someone who starts to avoid others. And again, this is a change, not someone who's always been isolated. New or increasing use of drugs or alcohol, and even those that are legal or prescribed. And lastly, talking about death or suicide. And I will say this list is not all inclusive. So if you're worried that someone may have a mental health condition, I would definitely do a little more research and trust your gut. Signs of psychosis include things like hearing or seeing things that aren't there, irrational responses to loved ones, or other inappropriate or bizarre behavior. And that is another sign of mental distress. One of the most common myths about those who have mental illness, or those who are in crisis, or those experiencing any kind of mental distress, is that they're aggressive, violent, or dangerous. And so I want to talk about that for a little bit. Although the majority of individuals who are in crisis or experiencing some kind of mental distress do not commit acts of violence, highly publicized acts of violence that are committed by persons with mental health conditions, such as the shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018, things like that reinforce not only individual but community beliefs that mental illness is something to be afraid of. And the reality is there are some people with mental health conditions that commit violence. But there are also people without diagnoses that commit similar acts. Violence is complicated, and mental illness alone doesn't explain someone's risk for violence. While some studies do show that persons with serious mental health conditions, specifically bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other personality disorders, are at increased risk of committing violent acts when compared to the general population, the strongest predictor of future violence is actually past violence. So other factors that can increase someone's risk for violence include substance use, especially if they're currently under the influence, age and gender. And when I say this, I mean statistically young men are more likely to act violently. Social stress, personal crises or loss is a predictor of violence, and that includes recent unemployment, divorce. Even if you're the victim of violence, that actually makes you more likely to commit violence, and exposure to violence during formative childhood years. People with mental health conditions also have higher rates of victimization than the general population and are often themselves actually the victims of violent crimes. Studies show that persons with mental illnesses are somewhere between 2.5 to 11 times more likely to be the victims of violent crimes. So it's important that we not continue to spread and perpetuate the idea that people with mental illnesses are dangerous, because the vast majority of people with mental health conditions are never going to commit any sort of violent crime. Mental health conditions, addiction or substance use issues, and even homelessness are all things that have the belief attached to them that when someone has one of these traits, that something is wrong with that person, that they're violent or dangerous and deserving of fear. And it's because of this negative and false belief that when it comes to actually addressing these issues, people use the phrase, not in my neighborhood, and try to actively expel people who have these traits, or even whisper about it behind closed door about their neighbor, who's dealing with these issues, and no one does anything about it. And these fears also arise when organizations are interested in building treatment facilities or recovery houses nearby neighborhoods. Remember, these issues exist in your neighborhood, whether you know about it or not. You cannot get rid of them. And it's important to remember that not only do these stigmas affect the culture of our neighborhood, but they can also be damaging to individuals. At the end of the day, people, real people, are the ones who suffer. So I want to share with you a video that I find really moving personally. So I just want you to take some time to watch it. And if you have the opportunity, pause afterwards to reflect on what happens.
You can be born perfectly rich, have a very good lifestyle, have parents who care very well for you, I don't think mental health issues discriminate against anyone of any race, gender, or social background.
Hi, nice to meet you. Please have a seat.
My name is Nicole. I'll be your moderator for this discussion.
I'm Nicholas. Today, I'm going to ask you a few questions about mental health in Singapore. What do you know about mental illness?
I just know there's depression.
How do you say that? Bipolar disorder.
The wire short circuit, you know.
This guy's crazy, all these kind of words.
Has nothing to do with me.
Would you hire somebody with mental health condition?
I'll probably, make them work in a, admin side.
Sweeper, cleaner, or some simple job for them.
Either they hurt themselves or they're going to hurt someone else. Then if you're mental illness, you apply for a job. But who in the right sense would really want to take you?
Would you date somebody who has a mental health condition?
Some of them will get quite manipulative. They'd say like, if you break up with me, I'll cut myself or I'll kill myself.
And then sometimes they tend to post unreasonable things, such as like a small thing that happened, and then they'll make a big fuss out of it.
I cannot handle. I don't know how to handle.
How would you react to, a friend or family member who's diagnosed with mental illness?
The bridging needs to be the family and not a stranger.
我们不是专业医生，我们可能处理不了。
If possible, I would just stay away as far as possible.
这个笑诶，最好是不要靠近他。
I didn't introduce myself fully. I suffer from clinical depression.
I was clinically diagnosed with depression. I'm living in recovery.
And I overcame it. I wrote a letter that I would like you to read out to me aloud.
"12 years is a long time to live with a mental health condition.
In the 12 years that I have been diagnosed with depression,
This is what I've learned.
I've learned that the greatest battles we fight are the ones with ourselves.
I've learned that most conversation about employment end the moment I review my diagnosis.
I've learned that shame is something society teaches you.
I've learned how to say sorry for showing symptoms of my condition.
I've learned that friends can disappear, and I will never hear from them again.
I've learned that family doesn't always know how to support you, no matter how much you need them.
I've learned that hope is a little voice that whispers maybe.
I've learned that recovery is a process.
I've learned that one small crack doesn't mean I'm broken.
I've learned that I have an illness, but this illness is not my identity.
so sorry that you have to go through this.
I'm so sorry.
Do you have any questions you want to ask me?
So like I said, I encourage you to take a couple minutes to just process what happened in that video. I know the first time I watched it, I got emotional, and I think too, it's because I personally have had my own struggles and know people that have struggled with their mental health. And there is a lot of stigma and deep shame associated with mental health conditions. Having a mental health condition doesn't mean that something is wrong with someone. It simply means that they're struggling and need help. And so many times people are judged because of their mental health conditions. And even though someone can have or may have a mental health condition their entire life, with proper treatment or learning how to address their symptoms in healthier ways, someone with a mental health condition can do everything they want to and lead a full and happy and fulfilling life. But the first hurdle in addressing the general mental health in our neighborhoods is by first conquering that stigma in ourselves. It's important to enter any situation with someone who's struggling without any assumptions about their thoughts, behaviors, or what they're experiencing. Although mental health conditions are very common, every person who has one will experience it differently because we are all individual people with different traits and life experiences. And the best way to intervene and improve our community's mental health is by actively being engaged in prevention efforts, not only for ourselves and our families, but in our broader neighborhoods. So if we want to improve our neighborhood's mental health, we have to start with ourselves and our families. So first and foremost, we can begin by normalizing conversations about mental health. This means not only talking about when things are going well, but also talking about our negative emotions, our struggles and challenges. Emphasizing self-care is very important. Self-care is everything we do in a day to take care of our physical and mental health. So physically, making sure you have a good night's sleep, eating as healthy as possible, and exercising on a regular basis. Mentally, it means finding time for yourself every day. And this is something you should be doing regardless of anything else that's happening in our life. You don't want to wait until things go wrong to prioritize self-care, because then it's too late. Something I hear often is that quote, "I don't have time for that." I don't have time for myself. I promise you, you do. Take that time that you would normally consider to be wasted to do, a 10-minute breathing activity. Take a 30-minute nap, or do something else that you would enjoy, even if you consider it to be frivolous. Self-care is not frivolous because it will help you function better in every other part of your life. Take a second and think about times in your life when you felt overwhelmed. Just feeling overwhelmed makes it harder to do your jobs. So when you take that time and try to address those feelings before getting into the task, it can make a difference. And intentional time can even be incorporated into existing duties and things you already do. So, for example, if you have a 30-minute commute to work, find something to listen to that makes you feel happy and relaxed. Maybe it's a podcast, maybe it's a radio station, maybe it's the news. Just find something for you. Self-care also means setting boundaries in your life. Give yourself permission to set limits in your relationships and to say no, not only at home, but in your professional and social life. And yes, this includes setting boundaries with your neighbors, even the ones that you may worry about. You may worry that they're struggling. It's your job to support and care for others whenever you're able, but you can't make people get help, and you shouldn't be sacrificing your own mental health for theirs. Second thing we can do to set ourselves up for success is learn to cope with our stressors in healthier ways. This starts by recognizing what you're currently doing and actively working to correct those behaviors. It will take time and practice. Give yourself grace. Don't beat yourself up. Instead, take your missteps as learning opportunities and move forward. Always recognize when your healthy coping methods actually can drift into an unhealthy territory. For example, let's say you really enjoy gardening, but you start to notice it isn't taking the edge off like it used to, or that you're relying on it too much. And you're relying on it so much that other responsibilities begin to be neglected. It's a good idea to actually have a few go-to coping strategies so that when this is happening, you can have a backup. And ideally, these ways of coping shouldn't cost a lot of money, just in case that no longer becomes an option. Also, seek outside help for yourself or family members as needed. Therapy can be an incredibly valuable way to address any disruptive thoughts or behaviors you're experiencing, and don't have to have a mental illness to benefit from therapy. At least 30% of Americans have received mental health treatment at some point in their lives. Many times, medication will also be suggested as part of the treatment process, and most agree that mental illnesses arise from chemicals in our brain, and medications can help balance these chemicals out and give therapy time to work. But again, decide what's best for you in consultation with your doctor. And there are also other sources of outside help, such as community support groups, online forums, and even call centers that can be helpful during these times of distress. And I'll be sure to mention some later. So while you're taking care of your own mental health needs, you can support the mental health and wellness of those around you. It starts with my first point previously, which is by modeling and sharing about mental health, your mental health in positive ways, even in challenging times. And this creates a space where those around you may feel comfortable doing the same. So be sure to compliment those around you. That can be helpful for their mental health, and remind them that they're valued members of your family. And lastly, when they are struggling, do what you can to make sure they get the help that they need. And the skills that you build for yourself and your family can carry over, and they should carry over into your neighborhood, especially when you work to normalize those conversations on mental health. This behavior is something you can continue to model to those around you, speaking on your own emotional struggles, sharing what you do to cope in healthy ways, and even inviting others to join with you in certain activities. For example, let's say you go on a walk every morning. Invite your neighbor that seems to be struggling to join you. Say you really want to spend the time with them. You're looking forward to it. You can also take time to share your history of mental health treatments. You don't have to share every nitty-gritty detail, but leading by example can go a long way. You never know when that story will show someone that not only is recovery possible, but that they know someone who's been through it too. You can be a resource when they struggle. For example, when the Mental Health Association of East Tennessee's CEO, he moved into his neighborhood in 2000. The welcome wagon came and they found out what he did and immediately said something along the lines of, we don't have any of those problems here. Well, guess who was in the MHA office the following month doing a depression screening? The head of the neighborhood association. So you never know how these things can come back around and actually help someone around you. And when interacting with others in your neighborhood, always start from a place of welcoming instead of judgment. Don't make assumptions based on someone's initial appearance or behavior. Instead, take the time to get to know them. And even if you know that person has a mental health condition, refuse to define them by their diagnosis or use labels like crazy. Someone is a person first and a diagnosis second. Always be as respectful as possible, especially be aware of the noise levels you're creating. Unexpected and loud noises can affect your neighbor's day-to-day life, especially if they struggle with their mental health, but regardless, especially including their sleep and mental functioning. So if you're planning a large project, do your neighbors the courtesy of letting them know ahead of time. Respect also includes driving through your neighborhood at a reasonable speed. All of these things decrease fear because they know what to expect, and they are not going to be afraid. And this will help your neighbors feel safer and calmer and more secure. It's also important to continue building a sense of community and connection. The better we know our neighbors, the more likely we will be able to identify when someone begins to struggle and be able to step in with information and support. And some ways that we can build community for those around us can be simple things like waving to our neighbors when we pass by, or even setting up play dates for the kids. Also, take the time to get to know your neighbors and introduce yourself. Hang out on your porch or in your front yard. You can create a neighborhood directory, like drop off a sign-up sheet in everyone's mailbox, and once they return it, you can email the final version to everyone. It can include information such as the names, phone numbers, and email addresses of everyone in the neighborhood, and even include the names of children and pets. This can be helpful when a dog is lost, or if you're trying to find a neighborhood friend for your child. And you can also include local resources in the neighborhood directory, things like churches, food pantries, or other resource centers that can assist someone in need. So they're not having to do that research themselves when they start struggling. And something we can do when the pandemic is sort of at its close is organizing a neighborhood get together. Keep it simple if it's the first year doing it, but a block party is a great place to start. Some other things that can be done to help build a sense of community to improve your neighborhood's mental health include building a free mailbox library, building a community garden, creating a formalized tool sharing program, create a bicycle or even a car sharing program. You can build a blessing box where you share non-perishable food, toiletries, and other supplies that others in your community need. You can establish a neighborhood watch program, create a skill sharing program. For example, maybe you're an accountant and you can offer neighbors your services for a discounted rate. Maybe you're good with cars or home repairs, or even you're good at cooking, crafting, or sewing. All of these skills can be beneficial to others. Lastly, you can begin hosting a monthly meeting. And if this isn't something you're doing already, this meeting can be a wonderful opportunity to bring in speakers from outside organizations to better inform residents on important social issues. For example, maybe you have concern about your neighborhood's mental health, or maybe it's starting to become an issue. The Mental Health Association of East Tennessee is always available to speak to groups on mental health education. Maybe you have concerns about internet safety. Street Hope Tennessee is a great organization that conducts trainings on internet safety, specifically with the goal of keeping children safe. Metro Drug Coalition can speak with you about substance abuse and even train you to use Narcan, and provide you with kits to save someone's life in case of an overdose. You can even invite someone to talk to you about gardening and offering a cooking class. Beardsley Farm and Century Harvest Farms are both organizations that can do both of those things, and they're wonderful organizations. So if you could pause the video, and I want to encourage you to take a moment and think about a problem that exists in your neighborhood. Brainstorm actions you can take to address that issue. Hopefully you've got some great ideas about things you can do in your neighborhood. But you may be wondering, what do these things, how do community gardens, how do having, a free mailbox library, how does having a postbox library help improve my neighborhood's mental health? Well, for many that struggle with their mental health, they don't become that way overnight. For most, it's an accumulation of circumstances that bring them to the point of distress or crisis. Even mental health conditions are often triggered by life circumstances, especially those that result in chronic stress. And one of the life circumstances that can significantly contribute to chronic stress is loss of income. This one stressor trickles down into every part of someone's life. They may no longer be able to afford nutritious meals for their family, or make needed repairs on their home, or even their cars, which then would prevent them from getting a new job. This is where a neighborhood can step in and create a bicycle sharing program, a blessing box, or a community garden. The bicycle sharing program would enable someone to access community resources without needing a car. A blessing box could fill the gaps when a family can't make it to a food bank, or maybe they've run out of food stamps for that month, or maybe they're not even aware of community resources. So having something in the area would work a lot better. And a skill sharing program can help teach a parent to cook who doesn't know how to make nutritious meals for their family. And a mailbox library can give someone access to a book that could provide some stress relief during those times. All of these things taken together can create an environment where our neighbors work together to help each other, which in turn can decrease mental distress and improve our neighborhood's mental health. However, mental health is complicated. Even when we work to set systems that decrease risk and increase the support in our communities, you can't control every single factor and circumstance. Therefore, there will always be those around you that experience mental distress and crisis. And it's your responsibility as someone who's a neighbor, friend, family member to offer support and intervene in healthy and supportive ways. It's not your job to get help for them. It's your job to support them along the way. During times of general mental health distress, not crisis, immediate intervention with services is not needed. You definitely want to step in with intervention, but it doesn't have to be as quick as calling mobile crisis or calling 911. But when someone is in crisis, they do need intervention as soon as possible. And remember, a quick reminder, a mental health crisis is a situation where someone's behavior puts them at risk of hurting themselves or others, or prevents them from being able to care for themselves or function effectively in the community. If the person is not in crisis, step in and offer information and support. Be careful with the words you use and be sure not to come across as accusatory or punishing. Instead, approach the person from a place of caring and concern. So instead of saying something like, hey, I noticed your yard's been a mess lately. Are you depressed or something? Instead, say something like, hey, I noticed you haven't been acting like yourself lately. I care about you. I'm concerned. What's going on? Not too many difference in the actual words you use, but the approach is so much different. And use open-ended questions whenever possible. The person may not ready to be talked to you, but just by trying to start the conversation, you've made it known to them that you're a resource when and if they're ready to talk. You can also help this person by helping with things around their house, things like mowing their lawn for them when they haven't had the energy to mow because of their depression, or by doing research on different treatment providers in the area that they can go to when they're ready to seek help. Ultimately, decision is in their hands on whether or not they access help, but you can make the process easier when they do start to, and when they do start treatment, let them know they can talk to you about what's happening. Intervention during a crisis is a little more complicated. Not only do you need to think about the safety of the other person, but you need to think about your own safety as well. And there are a variety of different mental health crises that someone could experience while you'll want to intervene as soon as possible. First, if someone has threatened or has attempted suicide, if someone has overdosed or ingested another toxic substance, and lastly, if someone is behaving in a highly agitated or threatening manner, or even displaying other inappropriate behavior that would give you some indication that something is going on. And regardless of the type of crisis, it's always be sure to take them as serious cries for help. The first crisis I'll be talking about is when someone makes a suicide threat. Suicide threats are when someone makes direct or indirect threats that they will take their own life. Examples of direct statements include when someone says something like, I've decided to kill myself, or I'm going to end it all, or if XYZ doesn't happen, I'll kill myself. Indirect statements can be things like, my family would be better off without me, or I can't do it anymore. It's important to trust your gut, however, and if you believe someone is making some sort of a suicide threat or exhibiting suicidal behavior, intervene accordingly. Begin by listening to the person or asking directly if they're suicidal. It's okay to talk about suicide. Ask them how long they've been feeling that way, and avoid saying things like, you shouldn't feel that way. Avoid arguing or saying things like, what would your family think? Also remove any access to lethal means, in particular restricting access to firearms or certain medications. It's a temporary restriction until you and the person are confident that they're out of the crisis period. So it's completely okay for your neighbor to give you their firearms temporarily if they are suicidal. And if the person is agitated, be sure to stay at a distance and be aware of your own movements, as the person may fear sudden movements or being cornered. Then help the person access help. And ideally, the person will receive services willingly. I recommend you beginning by calling the local mobile crisis number, which I've listed on this slide. It is through Helen Ross McNabb. It's a 24/7 number, and they'll work with you to find the least restrictive placement for someone during this time. Someone can call for themselves, or you can call for consultation to figure out what are the right steps for this person. Mobile crisis is the first number you should call to do an assessment and recommend treatment, but there are a few circumstances where mobile crisis will not respond and instead recommend that you call other emergency services, in particular law enforcement. So some situations where you would want to do this is if you have a fear for your own safety. In that event, you would get in touch with law enforcement, and be sure to emphasize that it's a mental health crisis and that you would like to request a trained officer if possible. There are what are known as CIT officers, and CIT officers have 40 hours of training to better help people in psychiatric crises. Knox County also has a new program where a behavioral health specialist is paired with a KPD officer in order to divert those experiencing mental health crises from the criminal justice system and instead connect them with the help needed. If someone, in the case of suicide attempts, especially when someone requires medical attention, mobile crisis, again, we'll recommend that you instead reach out to emergency services or get the person medical attention immediately. So this can mean calling 911. And when you do make that call, again, give them all the information you have. If the person who attempted is unconscious, if they're still conscious, try to receive any information that they're willing to share about any substances that have been taken, or if the person has any other medical problems, because all that information can make a difference when emergency personnel are intervening. Also be sure to let the 911 operator know that it's a mental health call. All of that information is very helpful. And once the person has received medical intervention, then they should be connected to services that help them after discharge. If the situation involves a potential overdose, again, call 911. Collect information on what was taken, how much was taken, what time it was taken, and the dosage if it was a prescribed medication. If you have received previous naloxone or Narcan training and the person's experienced an opioid overdose, please administer this intervention before calling emergency services. But regardless, you want to call 911 and emergency services need to intervene. Then the last mental health crisis, which I think can be the scariest for people. So agitated, threatening, or other inappropriate behavior, it can be difficult to find in a way that indicates the severity of the mental health crisis. A lot of personal perspective comes into play in a big way, and whether or not you feel personally safe in this situation. And honestly, it can be very frightening and traumatic to observe some of these behaviors, especially if they're extreme. And while it's important to respect and honor the feelings that we're having, that fear, it's also important to take a step back and think about the behaviors critically. You know, how dangerous is this situation actually? Because our gut reaction of fear can result in calls being made to police that don't need to be made. And it can be uncomfortable to talk about, but persons with untreated mental illnesses are 16 times more likely to be killed during police encounters than others without mental illnesses. Because of this, try to exhaust all other options before involving law enforcement. The criminalization of mental health is a very real thing. And many of those who deserve proper treatment instead find themselves in the back of a police car. Keep in mind, most of those who experience mental health crises are not violent, like I've said previously, and many only present, may only present dangerous behaviors under certain circumstances and conditions. So if someone is exhibiting signs of agitation, such as physical or mental unease, tension, restlessness, irritability, excitement, uncooperativeness, anxiety, or motor activity that is excessive, inappropriate, or purposeless, try to assess a few key points that will help you determine if law enforcement needs to be contacted. And again, if you're having to make this decision a lot quicker, you may not have time to go through this list. You have to trust your gut and not only maintain your own safety while thinking about the other person's safety. So think about the following questions. Does the person have available weapons? Is the person making threats of harm to self or others? Does the person have a history of violence? What level of self-control is the person exhibiting? If the person is behaving extremely unable to sit still or communicate effectively, maybe they have wide eyes, they're rambling, clutching themselves or other objects to maintain control, begging to be left alone, or even offering frantic reassurances that they're okay, then those things show that the person is close to losing control. Has the person used any substances? If so, alcohol and drugs lower a person's inhibition and also make it more difficult to de-escalate safely. And is the person showing aggressive behaviors such as advancing toward you, refusing to respect your personal space, or making threats toward you? If you answered yes to any of those things, then the chance of violence has increased. And again, you've got to make the decision that you think is best not only for the other person, but for your own safety. So don't be afraid to call 911 or law enforcement if needed, if you think it is the best option for that person. Ultimately, your safety and the safety of the others is a priority if someone is exhibiting any of these signs that indicate they could become aggressive. However, if a person does not have access to a weapon, has no known history of violence, and appears to be mostly in control of their behaviors, then it's safe to begin intervening without the presence of law enforcement. First and foremost, do not attempt to reach out and physically touch the person. Only do something like that when the person has calmed down. Always ensure your own safety in the situation first. This means being aware of others in the room, objects such as chairs or tables, and always be aware of where there are any exits or openings. This is not only for your own safety, but for the safety of the person in crisis. You want to be sure you have access to the exit without blocking theirs, so they don't feel trapped. The perception of threat is the primary cause for escalation of conflict. And so when someone is crisis, they may not be paying attention to what you're saying, but they'll instinctively pay attention to the tone of your voice and body language. So with that being said, be sure that you are calm, that there is no anger or fear in your voice, and that you're holding your body in a non-threatening way. So clenching your fists or crossing your arms over your chest are big no-nos. However, if someone is upset, you also don't want to immediately step in by saying, oh, it's important to stay calm, in a super calm and quiet voice, because doing so invalidates the way that they're feeling, making them feel that you're not truly listening and that you're patronizing them. And there's an amazing technique where it's a de-escalation technique where you can help decrease someone's intensity, and the technique is called mirror and match. And this is something I recommend doing if there aren't really any acute safety concerns. With this technique, you match someone's original intensity and tone and then shift it. Our brain is hardwired to mirror others' behaviors. So if someone is big with you, respond with your own bigness with our body or voice. This validates their feelings and let them know you're taking them seriously. But instead of yelling and screaming like they might be, instead use calming words such as, I can tell you're really upset and I want to understand that. And then you gradually start to soften your body, voice, volume, and pay attention if they begin to match your change in tone. When they start matching you, continue shifting down. Move things to a softer place. And you can even eventually attempt to sit down and then see if they mirror that behavior as well. When that happens, you can even begin to ask questions that get to the root of the problems. For example, if the person is having delusions or hallucinations that are causing their agitation, or did someone say or do something threatening and was it misinterpreted? If the person begins to respond to your questions, that means a different part of their brain is being engaged, the front part of their brain. And the front part of our brain, the frontal lobe, is the part of our brain that's involved in making good and long-term and thought-out decisions. And then once they start making that transition to the front part of their brain, you can work with them to address the root cause of the problem and link them to supports. If the person does not begin to calm down, makes a legitimate threat against you or another person, or is in possession of a weapon or another toxic substance, the next step would be to notify law enforcement. If the situation doesn't feel safe, please don't attempt to continue to de-escalate. Leave the situation and call for help. And remember, in any situation, you can absolutely make a difference. People are like houses, they have cracks in the foundation, and some have bigger cracks because maybe they've had traumatic childhoods, or if they have experienced trauma later in life, or maybe they have a mental health condition. But when someone steps in and provides a listening ear, creates some of those neighborhood supports that we talk about, these cracks slowly start to get repaired. They may not go away, and it's not always going to fix things. But the strength that we have as people is 100%, well, not 100%. It's definitely influenced by the people and support we have around us. And those are things you can work on. So I'm entrusting you to our mission at the Mental Health Association of making our communities more responsive to the mental health needs of its people. Bring some of these ideas back to your neighborhood and start working to make it happen. And I and the Mental Health Association would love to help you along this journey. So a few things that we offer that could be helpful. MHA offers free mental health screenings through our website. For a variety of different mental health conditions. They can be a great starting point when someone is struggling. And we also have a call center, which I've listed that phone number, but it's 865-584-9125. And you can call the call center if you need information about a variety of mental health things, if you need resources or referrals, or if you just want to talk to someone, if you're struggling with your mental health and you need support, if you're caregiving for someone who's struggling with their mental health, then you need support for that. And if you have any questions or want to connect with me personally, you can email info@mheaet.com or call me at 901-871-5867. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful day.